gallon this weekend, according to the AAA. And high fuel costs are, in turn, increasing the price of consumer goods. The rate of inflation rose to a 40-year high last month. Here with me now is former Treasury Secretary and economic advisor to many Democratic presidents, Larry Summers. Thank you so much for joining me. Mr. Secretary, you have been predicting high inflation since last year. It is at 8.6%, the highest since December of 1981. Has it peaked, or could it climb even higher?
Depends on President Putin and what happens with oil prices. There's a risk that it will rise higher, and I don't think it's likely to fall back very, very rapidly. I think the Fed's forecasts have tended to be much too optimistic there, and I hope they'll recognize fully the gravity of the problem in their forecasts when they meet this week.
This weekend, gas prices did reach a stunning national average, $5 a gallon. Is there anything more the Biden administration can actually do to bring those prices down?
Not a lot. It's the gas price piece of this is driven by the geopolitical developments around Ukraine. It's hypocrisy in the extreme when people need to say we need to stand strongly with Ukraine and then blame the administration for the fact that gas prices are higher than they were a year ago. I've been disappointed by some of the almost demagogic statements that have been made in that regard. I think there are things we can do about inflation. The president did something very important when he met with Chairman Powell and underscored his respect for the independence of the Fed and made clear he thinks the Fed needs to do whatever is necessary, even if it's painful, to reduce inflation. I've advocated that we need a much more strategic tariff policy vis-a-vis China that takes tariffs down and therefore takes prices down for American consumers and for producers.
Should those tariffs be lifted?
Many of them should be. Many of them should be. We should focus on what's important, not raising input prices for American producers so they're less competitive, which is what much of those tariffs do. Instead, we should be focusing on things that allow the leakage of key technologies to China and the like. We should pass, at long last, some kind of legislation, ideally on a bipartisan basis, that would raise the vastly excessive Trump tax cuts, join the world in taxing corporations adequately, take down prescription drug prices. All of that would operate to reduce inflation. So there are things we can do. And Dana, if I can step out of my area for one second, I think the banana Republicans who are saying that what happened on January 6th was nothing or okay are undermining the basic credibility of our country's institutions. And that, in turn, feeds through for inflation. Because if you can't trust the country's government, why should you trust its money? So I think it's terribly important that we take the temperature down in Washington, that we recognize behavior that's just out of bounds of reasonable and decency. We give the Fed the room it needs. We bring down the budget deficit. We take down prices directly through prescription drugs. This is a challenge that we can meet if we're prepared to be serious about taking it on.
Secretary Yellen, who has the job you once had, said this week that, quote, there is nothing to suggest a recession is in the works. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't.
You think a recession is in the works?
I think that when inflation is as high as it is right now, and unemployment is as low as it is right now, it's almost always been followed within 2 years by inflation, by recession. I look at what's happening in the stock and bond markets. I look at where consumer sentiment is. I think there's certainly a risk of recession in the next year. And I think given where we've gotten to, it's more likely than not that we'll have a recession within the next 2 years. That is something we can manage. We've had them for the whole history of the country. We need to be prepared and to respond quickly if and when it happens. But I think the optimists were wrong a year ago in saying we'd have no inflation, and I think they're wrong now if anyone's highly confident that we're going to avoid recession.
Secretary Summers, thank you so much for joining me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we're here with our panel now. Scott Jennings, the Republican here. I don't know if you wore yellow because you knew he was going to call you a banana Republican, but what's your reaction to what he said about the economy and specifically the notion of how mistrust, distrust in government is feeding into the bad economy?
Well, first of all, I think his words on recession are what I took away from that interview, because he was right about inflation when the Biden administration was calling it transitory or short-term or not a real issue. Summers was right. They were wrong. I think the Biden administration's credibility on these things is very limited, and Summers has been right. So I think you ought to listen to Larry Summers about these issues, because he seems to know more than the Secretary of the Treasury, the President of the United States about it. And the economic issues, by the way, just as a political matter, that's what's killing the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, this midterm. This is the dominant issue. And as we head towards recession, even if it's not technically one right now, it certainly feels like one to people who are paying $150 to fill up their car.
Congresswoman, you're on the ballot. What do you think?
Well, I agree that we are facing a tremendous inflation. But what I think is also happening is that the Democrats, at least House Democrats, are doing all that they can to combat that for the American people, whether it's passing legislation in the House related to the shortage of baby formula, which got no support practically from Republicans, or price gouging, get oil and gas price gouging to combat that, where not one Republican supported it. We recognize that there's an issue, and we are doing what's necessary to fight against it. What we are not getting is the support from Republicans who say they are concerned with this, but are unwilling to do what's necessary to drive those prices down for the American people, which is evidenced by their nay votes on every measure that the experts say are necessary to bring down inflation.
Yes, but wouldn't it be nice if a little bipartisanship broke out? And I think it's possible. We're seeing it in the Senate over guns. And what I worry about, having served in the House for 9 terms, I call myself an escapee. I then went to the oasis of the Wilson Center for a decade, is that too much of this is the press release designed to blame the other side. And I really think some of these problems are solvable. I saw us miss one when I was there, which is letting the federal government bargain for lower drug prices. And the mistake there was President Obama decided he needed the support of Big Pharma, and they, of course, were against this. And so he took it out of the bill that we passed, the health care bill. And it was a huge missed opportunity. And all I'm saying is, I agree that these are serious problems. I agree that Democrats have a lot of the good answers, but they don't have all the good answers. And where are people who say, as the fellow you interviewed, Chris Jacobs, where are people who say I'm putting the country first? I just wish he were staying in Congress and trying to win again.
I want to turn to the January 6 hearings. We saw the first one in prime time this past week. We're going to see more starting tomorrow morning. Alyssa, you worked for Mark Meadows on Capitol Hill. You had several jobs in the Trump administration. There's testimony that Meadows burned papers in his office after meeting with Scott Perry, who was working to challenge the 2020 election. Do you think Mark Meadows destroyed documents?
I've heard that firsthand. I've heard it directly from someone with firsthand knowledge, so I believe that testimony that the committee has. I want to note this, which is related to the two conversations we're having. Someone smarter than myself pointed out that in 1974, during Watergate, inflation was 11%. Yet Congress still investigated the president and was able to work to address inflation and deal with the economy. American voters, we know the midterms are going to be about gas prices. They're going to be about bringing down inflation, consumer costs. But we also need to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th. We cannot have a corrupt former president who, by the way, I think is going to announce in the coming months that he's in fact running again, get away with what was more or less a coup attempt against the United States. So we need to be able to walk and chew gum. This is a moment we need bipartisanship. And hopefully we will see that as a result of these hearings.
I just want to go back to what you said. You do feel confident that you know that Mark Meadows, or you feel strongly that the person telling you is telling you the truth, that Mark Meadows destroyed documents?
I do, and I expect to see that come out in testimony from the committee. And again, this goes back to, I was in the House when we wanted to hold Secretary Clinton accountable for destroying documents and not upholding federal record-keeping laws.
Working for Mark Meadows.
Which was the right thing to do at that time. I'm somebody who thinks we need to call balls and strikes and hold ourselves to the same standards. It's wrong when Republicans do it. It's wrong when Democrats do it.
You worked on the former president's impeachment trial. What's your reaction to what you're seeing on these?
Well,
hearings?
I think what we're seeing is the flesh and the full body of what the members of the impeachment trial stated. I think we're getting the full plethora of evidence to back up the claims that, one, the president knew that he had lost the election. The president knew that without going through the courts was not going to give him what he wanted, and therefore he needed another means, and that was to use American people to attempt to overthrow the government and work towards that end. And I think what is even more disturbing are individuals, Republicans, who are not willing to come to the table and negotiate. And we're seeing that over and over again in so many instances, not willing to call balls and strikes, as the other panelists has said, and hold people accountable.
I mean, it's very difficult to watch all this footage again and not feel your blood boiling all over again. I mean, the thing about this issue is it all happened live on television. We all watched it. It didn't happen behind closed doors. We're not hearing conflicting reports.
And yet there are a lot of Republicans who say, don't believe your lying eyes.
And I don't know how you watch these videos, how you watch the testimony of Officer Edwards, who was completely compelling, and what she went through was horrific. How do you watch these things and not come to the conclusion that this was a terrible day, that somebody caused it, and that something has to come from this? Now, in the short term, there's nothing anyone can do about Donald Trump. He probably is going to run again. But in the long term, Republicans are going to have to decide, are we going to look to the future here in 2024 and the future of this country, or are we going to relitigate the 2020 election in this chaos again? I would submit it's better for the party to look to the future and put this behind us by acknowledging what happened.
Totally agree with that. Liz Cheney was magnificent, and her use of the term dishonor was just chilling. And she did a magnificent job, but also the footage speaks for itself. There's no counterfactual that's been offered. And I would recommend that the members of the committee stay off the airwaves because they're perceived as spinning what they did. And it would be much better if they just put the material on over and over again. I know there's an issue about who's the audience, but I think you reach a bigger audience if you don't.
I think one of the greatest things that's been shown by this hearing is hearing the words of Trump's inner circle himself.
Right.
It's not coming from Democrats. It's coming from those individuals who worked with the president to not just show, of course, we all know that there was a riot, there was an insurrection, but giving the evidence that it was the president who directed this and who was the one who instigated it is most important.
We have to leave it there. We're going to hear a lot more from people in the president's inner circle in the coming weeks in these hearings. Thank you so much, all of you, for that great discussion. And